Hello there, how is it going? My name is Andrew and you're listening to Chatterbox, the QLIP series for intermediate to advanced English learners, where you get to hear real conversations between English native speakers about a fascinating topic. Today, we have a very, very special episode because in just a moment, I'm going to be joined by Australian wildlife expert Joey Clark. He is the Senior Science Communicator at the Australian Wildlife Conservancy, and we're going to have a conversation about some super interesting animals that call Australia home. Earlier this year, I had the absolute pleasure of visiting Australia, and while I was there, I got to see some of these animals up close and personal. And I would say that I'm a nature lover. I find all kinds of plants and animals fascinating. But when it comes to unique wildlife, the kind of wildlife that you can't really find anywhere else on the planet, well then Australia is one of the first places, at least that pops into my mind. So while I was visiting, I really wanted to learn more about Australian wildlife, and I was lucky enough to be able to connect and talk with Joey and learn so much interesting information from him, and I'm excited that I'll be able to share this conversation with you here today. Now, during our conversation, Joey and I talked about a variety of topics, all related to Australian wildlife and conservation. And we discussed Joey's background and his journey into wildlife conservation, how he got started with that. We talked about the unique landscapes of the Australian bush and some of the incredible animals that live in these areas, including some of Joey's favorites. We also talk about so many other things, including some of the differences between marsupials and placental mammals, the major threats to Australian wildlife, like habitat loss and invasive species, and also we talked a little bit about fire and the impact of fire on the Australian landscape. And to help you follow along with this episode and to make sure that you can understand as much as possible, we've prepared an interactive word-for-word transcript, a helpful study guide, and also a vocabulary glossary that will explain some of the key language, the key vocabulary and concepts that you might be unfamiliar with. So it will break that down and explain it to you in a really clear way. You can refer to these tools anytime during the episode to get a better understanding of our discussion. To access these tools, of course, you must be a QLIPS member. You can sign up and become a QLIPS member by visiting our website, qlips.com, and you get so many other bonuses and benefits when you're a QLIPS member. You can find all of the details on the website and sign up there. And if you enjoy this episode, please consider supporting the work done by the Australian Wildlife Conservancy. The link to visit their website and support them with a donation is in the description for this episode. Finally, just before we get started, I'm going to try something new with this episode. I'm going to jump in from time to time and pause the conversation occasionally just to break things down and explain it to you in more detail. I think this way you'll be able to follow along with the conversation a little more easily. So let's give it a try, and later on you can let me know how it goes. Leave me a comment or some feedback on our Discord server. I'd love to hear what you think of this kind of format. And without any further ado, let's get started with the conversation. We'll start with chapter 1, where we get introduced to Joey Clark and learn about his background. Here we go. I'm here today with Joey Clark, Senior Science Communicator at the Australian Wildlife Conservancy. Joey, welcome to QLIPS. It's so great to have you here, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation we're going to have today.
Thanks, Andrew. I'm looking forward to speaking to you.
So maybe we could start things off, Joey, by just having you share a little bit about yourself and your journey into wildlife conservation.
Sure. Well, I was really lucky as a child. I grew up in an area of natural bushland and forest called the Blue Mountains, which is in eastern Australia. And it meant that throughout my childhood, I was surrounded by the bush and by wildlife. While I was a teenager, my family cared for some of the animals that were around our place. So we looked after a young wombat, which is, I guess, a little bit like a badger from the Northern Hemisphere, but a marsupial version. And we cared for this animal for a year and a half. It was an orphan, so its mother had died. And then soon after that, we looked after a kangaroo as well. So we had these incredible experiences as a family up and close with some of Australia's really special wildlife. And I think from there, it was kind of destiny that I would move into work in an area that was to do with wildlife and nature and conservation. It's something I've been passionate about for as long as I can remember. And so I studied biology and conservation, environmental science at university. And I found out about this group, Australian Wildlife Conservancy, just as I was finishing my science degree. And I feel really lucky that this organization sort of came to exist at just the right time, so that, as I was finishing my studies, there was this incredible opportunity to go and work in a remote part of Australia as a tour guide at one of the sanctuaries managed by Australian Wildlife Conservancy. And from there, I've sort of got into science communication and other parts of the business. So that was my path into conservation.
So in chapter 1, Joey told us that he grew up in a natural area called the Blue Mountains in eastern Australia, surrounded by wildlife. His family even cared for animals like wombats, which are small, burrowing marsupials who dig holes in the ground. This early experience led him to study biology and conservation at university, and after graduation, then he joined the Australian Wildlife Conservancy. And he started working there as a tour guide in a sanctuary. And a sanctuary is a word that you'll hear often in this interview. It's a protected area where wildlife is preserved and kept safe. And then over time, Joey got into science communication, which means explaining scientific information to the public. Kind of what he's doing exactly in this interview. Chapter 2, The Australian Bush. You just mentioned that you grew up in the bush. And the bush in a Canadian context means more like a really thick forest. But I'm wondering, in an Australian context, what kind of landscape is the bush?
What a great question. It's a word that's kind of used all across Australia for, anywhere that's not an urban environment is sometimes called the bush. I guess in my mind, I picture eucalypt forests. So there are the trees that are most common in Australia are eucalypts or gum trees. They're also planted overseas in plantations, but these are quite messy looking trees. So they have branches that kind of sprawl out at all angles. It's very different to a pine forest or an oak tree. They're quite random and beautiful shapes, I think. And there are all different sorts of eucalypts across Australia. But yeah, mostly when I think of the bush, that's the sort of, forested landscape that I'm picturing. Quite often they're not thick forests. They're open, might have a grassy understory. So it ranges from woodland to tall forest in some of the wetter parts of the country. And some eucalypts are huge. They can grow to over 100 meters tall. Others are little, we call them mallee, which is kind of a shrub, a shorter tree version of the same sort of plants. But yeah, Australia is very diverse. So that's one sort of forest, but there are also little pockets of rainforest in the tropics. There's obviously a lot of desert and arid grasslands. And because of that diversity of ecosystems, what we sometimes dismiss as the bush, it's actually a very, very diverse continent full of different vegetation and wildlife.
Sure. So you just have that one nickname for it, but it's actually really diverse in reality.
Yeah, it's a shorthand way of referring to outside, basically.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, let me break down what we just heard. So in Australia, the term bush refers to any non-urban area, which can include a variety of landscapes. And Joey describes the typical bush as eucalypt forests, which are open and grassy, unlike the kind of forests that I'm used to in Canada, which are quite thick. Eucalypts, or gum trees, are trees with sprawling branches, and Joey mentions that they can look quite messy. Australia also has rainforests, deserts, and dry, arid grasslands, making it a very diverse continent. And Joey also mentioned mallee, which are smaller, shrub-like versions of eucalypt trees. Moving forward with the interview, here we go to Chapter 3, Unique Australian Wildlife. So I think when many outsiders like me and our audience as well, when we think of Australia, the wildlife is one of the first things that pops into our minds. And there's so many unique species here, and it's so diverse, as you mentioned. Of course, we're not going to have time to talk about all of the animals today, but maybe you could tell us about one of your favorites or one of the animals that you find the most fascinating.
What a fantastic question. And I might have to squeeze in more than one, but I'll start with the one that I usually nominate as my favorite animal, if I have to choose, is called a tree kangaroo. So I think most international listeners will be aware of kangaroos. You know, they're the famous hopping marsupials that give birth to very, very small young, and then most of the development for their, the young animals happens in a pouch on the female's belly. And that's common across marsupials. But far less well known is a group of that family called tree kangaroos. And these are incredible. So if you imagine kangaroos as these tall mammals that are kind of specially adapted for hopping across grasslands and open country, tree kangaroos are what happens when that sort of animal tries to evolve to live like a monkey and live in the rainforest. And to be honest, kangaroos are not a good starting point for that. So tree kangaroos are quite clumsy. They've still got fairly long feet. So, they're not great at climbing trees. But they're these beautiful animals that are only found in the rainforest in Australia and also a few in New Guinea. They're quite difficult to see. Everything in the rainforest is difficult to see, but they have beautiful long tails that act as a kind of counterbalance while they're clambering through the branches. They feed on leaves. And I guess one of the interesting things about Australia is how marsupials have evolved to fill roles in the ecosystem which are in other parts of the world filled by placental mammals. So if tree kangaroos are the equivalent of monkeys, we've got little possums and sugar gliders that are kind of the equivalent of squirrels or things like that. And, the list goes on. There's kind of these analogues in Australia for other mammals elsewhere in the world. But the country is dominated by marsupial mammals. And I think the tree kangaroos are just this incredible kind of outlandish example of that evolution of marsupials.
Yeah, it sounds hilarious to picture a kangaroo trying to climb a tree. Just the image is really funny. How big are they? Because I know the typical kangaroo that we think of can get quite big, right? But what about these tree kangaroos? Are they smaller?
Yeah, so they're shorter but quite stocky. So they'd stand maybe up to your knee or a little bit taller than that. They've got strong forearms with big claws, so that's to help them climb around. And really, really thick set. They can also hop along the ground, but when you hear them hopping through the forest, it's this big thump, thump, thump. So they're quite heavy and not great at hopping, not great at climbing trees, but very beautiful animals.
All right. Well, I'm going to have to go onto YouTube after we finish this conversation and search for them so I can see some footage, because you've piqued my interest here in the tree kangaroo.
Yeah, please do. Everyone should look them up.
In this chapter, Joey tells us that his favorite animal is the tree kangaroo, which is a type of kangaroo that's adapted to live in trees. Unlike regular kangaroos that hop on the ground, tree kangaroos are clumsy, which means that they are awkward or uncoordinated, especially at climbing. Tree kangaroos are shorter than regular kangaroos, but stocky, and stocky means they have a strong, heavy build. These unique animals are found in the rainforests of Australia and New Guinea, Marsupials, like tree kangaroos, have pouches for carrying their young, and Australia has many different types of marsupials. Joey also talks about placental mammals. Now, placental mammals are animals that give birth to fully developed young. These young are nourished before birth through an organ called the placenta. And the placenta connects the developing baby to its mother's uterus, providing nutrients and oxygen. Some examples of placental mammals include you. Humans are placental mammals. So are dogs, elephants, and many, many, many other kinds of mammals. Chapter 4. Marsupials and Placental Mammals. I was wondering, we're talking there about the differences between marsupials and placental mammals, I believe you referred to them as. Why is it that there are so many marsupials in Australia and other parts of, like you said, New Guinea? And I saw on Wikipedia that there are also some in the Americas, a few species in Central and South America as well. But why don't we see marsupials in Asia or Europe or Africa?
Yeah, that's a fascinating story too. And I guess there's sort of the traditional view of why that is, which was basically a colonial story that said that, Australia as a continent has been isolated for a very long time, for millions of years. And initially, scientists thought that marsupials represented an early, more primitive branch of mammal evolution. So they were kind of denigrated as, Australia was a backwater for this primitive offshoot of the mammal family tree, which had only been able to succeed because placentals hadn't arrived on the continent. So because it had been cut off from the rest of the world for so long. There's elements of that are true, but the sort of narrative that Australia's, a sanctuary for primitive wildlife was also very much to do with that colonial attitude of, European animals and people, at the same time were arriving and they were, superior and would ultimately dominate, native fauna, but it's also to do with, the removal of Indigenous Australians from the country, which was done, very forcibly. And that's linked to how ecosystems have changed over the last few hundred years as well. But back to the marsupial evolution. Marsupials were, they first appeared, I think in the Jurassic period, so quite a long time ago, branched off from other members of the mammal family tree. And there are fossils of them from other parts of the world. So they were in China as well. We know that there was a big radiation through Gondwana, which is the landmass that was made up of South America, Australia, Antarctica, and a few others. And so as those continents spread apart, they carried with them some of the fauna that had been found across that supercontinent, Gondwana. So in South America today, there are still opossums and some of the smaller marsupials there living alongside placental mammals. But in Australia, that's where marsupials really flourished. And I guess the bit of that, that first story that is true is that they've had a long period of isolation in which they've evolved and diversified to fill the variety of different habitats that Australia has to offer. And it's just incredible, the range of lifestyles that they've adapted to. There's a marsupial mole, which looks very much like moles in other parts of the world, that swims through the sands of the desert. People never, hardly ever see them because they're so rare and elusive. There are, little wallabies called bettongs and potoroos, which forage in the undergrowth of thick forest. There are bandicoots that snuffle through the leaf litter, feeding on fungus and invertebrates. Sugar gliders and other species of gliding possums, which can literally fly. It's not powered flight, but flying between trees, 80, 90 meters between trees. All of these things have evolved from, that original marsupial stock that was part of the Australian continent when it split off from Gondwana. And I think that whole story is just incredible, that natural heritage that we've been able to protect here in Australia.
So Joey tells us that marsupials, like kangaroos and koalas, are common in Australia due to the continent's long isolation. Marsupials first appeared in the Jurassic period, which was over 145 million years ago, and spread across the supercontinent called Gondwana. Now, as Gondwana split into smaller continents, the ones that we know today, marsupials flourished in Australia. This isolation allowed them to evolve into many unique forms, such as tree kangaroos and marsupial moles. Now, while marsupials exist in other places like South America, they're much more common and much more diverse in Australia. Chapter 5. Threats to wildlife. So maybe to transition a little bit now into talking about conservation and the conservation efforts that your organization is working towards as well. Could you talk a little bit about what are some of the biggest threats to Australian wildlife today?
Sure. Yeah, look, I guess as with elsewhere in the world, an obvious one is habitat loss. So just, the conversion of natural, wild landscapes into agricultural production landscapes or urban landscapes where people live. That's fairly universal around the world, that loss of habitat drives species to decline or go extinct and degrades ecosystems. If we leave that one aside, there has been lots of habitat loss, but it's probably not for some groups, that's the major driver, but there are other threats, even in landscapes that look intact. And we can sum it up as fire, feral animals, and weeds. And, essentially, fire is quite a complex one, so we can get into that. Feral animals, that's kind of straightforward. We know invasive species, again, they're a threat to native wildlife around the world. But in Australia, because of that long period of isolation, there were never any cats here, for example. And so when cats did arrive, it was a completely different sort of predator that Australian animals had no preconditioning of dealing with that kind of predation. Similarly, red foxes, which English people brought over to hunt, the hunted became the hunters. And so, foxes have spread across basically 2/3 of the south of the continent. And as cats and foxes arrived in new parts of the landscape, a whole host of small animals disappeared. And you can see very clearly in the historical records, huge abundance of native animals in explorers' accounts and, things that have been documented from that time. And within, sometimes within a decade, they would just crash because cats and foxes were feasting as they moved into new territory. So those feral predators are responsible for, at least 25 extinctions of native mammals. Yeah, which is, more mammal extinctions than anywhere else on Earth. So that's been devastating. And then other feral animals, there are some surprises here. So there's, horses, things like donkeys and camels, which you might not associate as, a big threat. Just again, because the Australian landscape isn't used to big herbivores of that kind that can move around, they can breed up into very large numbers quite quickly. They have different sorts of impacts. So yeah, lots of feral animals, and that's one of the biggest pressures on our ecosystems, one of the biggest threats. And then weeds, that's basically plants that are growing in places where they're having an impact, sometimes introduced on purpose, and they interact also with fire patterns. So, a really interesting example is a grass that was introduced as pasture for cattle, buffel grass. It grows in a way that forms this dense blanket. So it's kind of a thick layer of fuel, which means that fires are able to spread much more quickly and they burn much more intensely, which is different to how fire normally works in the Australian landscape. So that's really interesting because it's a weed that is in itself fine, but it affects the fire pattern, which then has an effect on wildlife.
Joey explains that the main threats to Australian wildlife include habitat loss, feral animals, and invasive plants, which we also sometimes call weeds. Now, habitat loss happens when natural areas are turned into farms or cities. Feral animals, are animals like cats and foxes, are predators that many Australian animals can't defend against. Feral animals are animals that once were domesticated and kept as pets or farm animals, but now are living out in the wild. Predators are animals that hunt and eat other animals. Think sharks, bears, lions. Okay, these are predators. So feral animals have caused many native species to become extinct, which means they no longer exist, and invasive plants or weeds can also change the natural fire patterns of Australia, making fires more intense and harmful to wildlife. Speaking of fires, we're going to talk about that in more detail right now. So let's move on to the next chapter, Chapter 6, Fires in Australia. I know a lot of our listeners are probably familiar with the tragic fires that happened several years ago and really made news around the world. How are the fires this year? What's the fire season like this summer?
And we sort of need to take a step back to just introduce sort of how fire is part of the landscape here. And it's a story that includes people because, as listeners will know, Indigenous Australians have been on the continent for at least 65,000 years. So we don't really use the word wilderness here anymore because there are no landscapes here that haven't been managed by people for thousands of years. And that's been quite a shift in how we think about conservation. We're not trying to just remove the influence of people from these landscapes. In fact, quite often, removing people is what has done the damage, and no more so than in how fire operates. So Aboriginal Australians, First Nations people used fire very widely across the continent. It would have looked a bit different in the desert to in the bush, in the eucalypt forests that we were talking about. But across almost every part of the country, fire was used very regularly as a part of life. It might have been to make it easier to move through the country, to draw in animals for hunting, or to promote the growth of particular plants that were sources of food. But no matter what the purpose was, there's now really strong evidence, as well as ongoing cultural practices, to show that fire was a big part of life and a big part of the bush for a very, very long time. Most of those fires probably were small in scale and fairly low intensity. So some people call it cool fire or healthy fire. And I think that's quite a shift too, to think about fire as a positive part of how an ecosystem functions. It's different to how we normally see fire as a threat or a danger.
Right, like a natural disaster.
Exactly. Yeah, but mostly in Australia, it's just been a part of life. And that's true with how the animals have adapted to fire as well. So typically, before colonization, there would have been small, patchy fires through woodlands and grasslands that maintained those habitats and also brought diversity. So because of the patchiness, you'd have one area that had burned just last year, and then within a few kilometers, an area that hadn't burned for 3 or 4 years, and so on. And people describe it as like a mosaic or a patchwork burning, quite intentional by the people that were living there. And the disruption that came with colonization when people were forced off the land was that instead of that diversity of small, patchy, relatively frequent burns, vegetation was allowed to grow for year after year after year. And so you'd end up with lots and lots of fuel on the ground. And instead of small fires, then you get very big fires that burn much more intensely and cover a much bigger area. And then the frequency is the other thing that we look at. So, it might be less frequent, but you might get much bigger area burnt when it does happen. And that's the pattern that is really damaging for biodiversity. So the sorts of management that we're doing now as a conservation organization, partly it's trying to emulate that original fire pattern, those original fire regimes. And we're working with traditional owners, with Indigenous people, to try and reinstate some of those burning practices that the landscape needs. So that's probably a different side to the fire story than, what makes headlines overseas when, what was it, 13 million hectares or something burns or even more. It's easy to see that as a disaster. In some cases, probably not that bad that some of those landscapes burned, but the scale and the intensity of those fires was unprecedented. So, we know that had an impact on some species, quite a severe impact. So they've been, from species that were fairly abundant, some of them are now critically endangered since that fire season. To come to your actual question, the last season, across northern Australia, there's fire every year in the sort of tropical savanna. That's normal. Largely, that's us, so traditional owners and conservation operators actually lighting fires at the right time of year. So that's good. That's fine. As we get into the later part of the year, we call it the dry season in northern Australia. That's when you get some of the bigger, hotter burns. And to my knowledge, it hasn't been that unusual this year. It's been sort of a standard year for fire. In the desert, there was a lot more rainfall over the past sort of 3 or 4 years, and that means more grass. And so there have been very big fires in the desert in central Australia. Again, partly that's a natural cycle driven by rainfall, but yeah, it's a natural part of the landscape. And if you get fire management right, you can have huge benefits for biodiversity and for conservation.
We just heard Joey explain that fire is a natural part of the Australian landscape. And fire has been used by Indigenous Australians. Indigenous means native to. So the original people who inhabited Australia before European contact, these Indigenous Australians have used fire for thousands of years to manage the land. These controlled burns were small and low intensity, which helped to maintain the diversity of habitats. And then after colonization, the removal of indigenous people and their fire practices, well, this caused a lot of problems. It led to larger, more intense fires. And Joey explains that proper fire management, including traditional practices, is crucial for biodiversity. Now, thankfully, this year, the fire season has been pretty normal, with controlled burns helping to maintain the balance. Chapter 7. Conservation Success Stories. So you've told me and told our audience here a little bit, some doom and gloom about the feral species and about fires, but I'm wondering if you could tell us maybe about a success story about some kind of species that was saved due to a conservation effort. I'm sure you have a success story as well.
Luckily, I've got too many to choose from. So our organization has been working in Australia for the last 3 decades. And basically it was started by an entrepreneur who had, he was familiar with the science. He knew what the threats to wildlife were, fire, ferals, and weeds. But he also saw an opportunity because there are really large properties in Australia that, they might have been used for grazing cattle for a few decades, but they're still pretty much, they look similar. The bush is still intact. The landscape still looks like it might have 100 or 200 years ago. So there was an opportunity to try and deal with those systemic threats at a landscape scale. And this guy, Martin Copley is his name, he started buying these huge properties, first in Western Australia and then across Northern Australia, with the goal of restoring them to ecological health by dealing with each of those threats. And one of the most exciting and sort of most successful initiatives that he set about doing was to develop a network of fenced areas. We call them safe havens. And these are not just your ordinary fence for stock, but they're sort of 6-foot high mesh fences. I mean, it's not quite Jurassic Park, but if you think that level of, electrified wires, they have an overhanging section so nothing can climb in. Anyway, very, very secure fenced areas, and they're very large scale. So some of these are, around 10,000 hectares is some of the largest ones. So we've got at least 10 of those. And by doing that, you can remove not just a few cats and foxes. You can actually get cats and foxes down to 0 You can remove the rabbits and the goats and whatever other feral animals are in there, and then re-establish populations of species that have disappeared from those regions. So we might take something like the numbat. So that's a beautiful little marsupial that eats termites. Again, one of these specialists. It's got an orange and black fur with white stripes along the back. They're quite small, maybe as long as your forearm, something like that. And they're just adorable. And they were found across, maybe a quarter of the Australian continent, feeding on termites happily in the woodland. They were decimated by cats and foxes, the same old story. But luckily, some of them survived. And that means that we've got a source population that we can use to repopulate these landscapes where we're working in our sanctuaries. So we've now established 4 populations of numbats within that network of safe havens. And, there are hundreds of them now in places like Western New South Wales, where before that, they'd been extinct for 100 years. So for a species that's endangered, could easily head towards extinction if nothing was done to intervene, we've now got secure populations being managed really effectively across that network of safe havens. And we've done that with a bunch of different mammal species. So there are places on our sanctuaries now which have 10 species that have been reintroduced. And that's, as far as we know, a world record for this kind of rewilding or reintroduction project. So it's really, really cool program.
Yeah, that's an amazing idea, the safe haven, and sounds like it's really effective. So that's great to hear.
Yeah, it's been super successful. And, there are species that are even closer to the edge of extinction. One is called the northern bettong. It's basically a pocket-sized wallaby. So, there's so many of these things that people probably haven't heard of before. But yeah, northern bettong, this one. And its population was down well below 1,000. There were maybe 750 left in the wild. And at that point, for a wild population, you're really in trouble. And so over the last 2 years, we built a dedicated fence just for that species in North Queensland. And we translocated 49 of those animals into that fenced area last year. They're doing really well. So they're breeding up now. And, in that case, it's an intervention that could well have prevented the extinction of that species. So it's such a privilege to be involved in work like that.
So we just heard Joey explain about the safe havens that have been created by the Australian Wildlife Conservancy. Now, these safe havens are large, secured, fenced areas that protect endangered species from predators like cats and foxes. Now, these fenced areas are really safe and secure. They have high mesh fences and electrified wires, which keep predators out. One success story that we heard about is the numbat, which is a small marsupial that eats termites. And termites are those little bugs that are famous for eating wood. Very dangerous if you get them in your house. Anyways, by creating these safe havens, they have reintroduced numbats to areas where they had been extinct for 100 years. Another success story we heard about is the northern bettong, a small wallaby whose population is now growing in a special dedicated fenced area in North Queensland. Chapter 8, Responsible Tourism. I think after listening to this interview, a lot of our listeners are going to think about visiting Australia as a tourist. And in fact, I'm here now as a tourist as well. So I'm wondering, how can we be responsible as tourists? How can we visit Australia without harming the wildlife?
That's a great question. I think, Australia is sort of famous as a nature destination. There's the whole nature tourism is a huge part of the appeal of visiting Australia. And, partly that's because of the landscapes. There are, these ancient landscapes here that are unlike anything else in the world. But yeah, the wildlife, of course, is another part of it. I think, as with any sort of nature tourism, just look up places that are actually working to care for the places where they work. So there's a number of our AWC sanctuaries where you can visit, a couple near Perth, You can go camping out in Central Australia if you want to see the desert in great health. I think it's looking at what each of these organizations is doing for the environment where they're working. And it's not just about conservation either. There's also, cooperation and collaboration with traditional owners, which is increasingly part of the tourism experience as well, especially in Northern Australia, but increasingly across the country. All of those initiatives are really positive, I think.
Let's just break down what we heard there from Joey. So he said that to be a responsible tourist in Australia, make sure to visit places that actively work to protect the environment. Look for nature tourism options that also involve cooperation with Indigenous people. And some of the Australian Wildlife Conservancy's sanctuaries offer such experiences, allowing you to enjoy Australia's unique landscapes and wildlife responsibly. Chapter 9. Learning more about the Australian Wildlife Conservancy. Finally, what about the Australia Wildlife Conservancy, the AWC, as you called it? Could you tell our audience a little bit more about where to find you on the internet and where they can learn more about your organization and what you guys do?
Sure. Yeah. So we're a non-profit NGO. So we're funded almost entirely by donations. If anyone's keen, they can head to australianwildlife.org. There's also Australian Wildlife Conservancy USA. So there's a charity set up that can direct funds from the US, and you get the tax benefit if you donate that way. Similar in the UK, so we've got an equivalent over there. So australianwildlife.org is the website. We've also got a really great presence across social media. So if you look up Australian Wildlife Conservancy, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, X, we're across all of those channels. I've run a series of webinars as well. So on YouTube, there's about 40 episodes of conversations between me and a bunch of our different field ecologists and land managers and staff from around the country. So that gives you a good picture of what life on the ground is like living and working on one of our wildlife sanctuaries in remote parts of Australia. So there's plenty of ways to keep in touch, and you can sign up for e-news as well through the website australianwildlife.org.
Okay, fantastic. Well, we'll try and link as many of those resources in the show notes for this episode as well, so that listeners can easily find them. But I think for now, Joey, that will bring us to an end. So thank you so much for sharing these great stories with us about Australian wildlife. It was fascinating for me to listen to them, and I think our audience will really enjoy them as well. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Andrew. It was great speaking with you.
All right, everyone, that brings us to the end of today's episode. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Joey. Personally, I think it's so amazing that we can improve our English fluency and also learn about fascinating topics such as Australian wildlife at the same time. If you're interested in learning more about the Australian Wildlife Conservancy and the work that they do, please visit australianwildlife.org. You can also follow them on social media and subscribe to their YouTube channel. We'll put the links in the description for this episode. We'd also love to hear your feedback and opinions about this episode. Of course, we'll be hosting a discussion about it on our Discord server. You can join the Culips Discord server to connect with like-minded English learners from around the world. It's totally free, and we'd love to have you join us there. The link to join is in the description for this episode. Once again, another massive thank you to Joey Clark for talking with me and for teaching me more about Australia and the magnificent plants and animals that call it home. Okay, everyone, please take care, and we'll be back soon with another brand new Culips episode. Until then, talk to you later. Bye-bye.